Hi guys, Geekonomics here once again. So what I'd like to do today is to make a little bit of a start on the A2 macroeconomics course. And to do that I'm going to be looking at the transmission mechanism of monetary policy. Those of you who are participating in the Bank of England competition, lots of schools around the country will be involved in that. It's the Target 2.0 competition. Your teachers will probably have had one of these booklets, and within that booklet the diagram, don't know if you can see that or not, the diagram which is behind me goes through the mechanisms and the mechanics of the transmission mechanism. So that's what I'm going to do today. And my two Year 12 groups, that's 12C and 12E, I expect you to have watched this by Monday of next week, and to have made the relevant notes on this so that we can come to the lesson fully prepared on that and ready to anticipate that you're going to have to answer some questions about the theory. So what's been happening in Geekonomics the last week or so? Well, I have been to France, bonjour tout le monde, and really interesting, some really great footage I've got for some stuff on transport economics. For example, when we were at the Dartford Tunnel, the crossing, absolutely horrendous, really does require significant investment in the UK transport infrastructure, public transport and so on, just a whole upgrade needed in order to encourage people to make that modal shift from the car to public transport. We then got to France, obviously, so we took the ferry to France. When we got to France, we were then faced with the sort of running the gauntlet past the migrants who are living, in these atrocious conditions in the camps at Calais, trying to make the break and get from Calais to the UK. And of course that highlights to us one of the problems of the European Union, the single market, where we have the free movement of goods, capital, but of course, excuse me, labour as well. And if labour wants to move from one country to another within the European Union, they're obviously free to do so. A lot of the people who are camped at Calais, of course, are not from the European Union, but people who are within the European Union, coming from former Eastern Bloc countries, trying to get to the UK, perfectly at liberty to do so. So that was interesting. Then we had obviously all of the students that we took were quite young, so we had all of the sort of exchange rate calculations to do, and we were looking at various we were looking at the various trades that go on within France, major exports, imports. So really interesting time. Anyway, I'll bring you some sort of further up-to-date news on that, but for today, as I say, we're going to go through the transmission mechanism of monetary policy. So who would this be beneficial to? It's beneficial for students who are continuing through their ASs into the A2s, because you can incorporate this particularly into ADAS analysis that you're going to get on essay questions potentially. And it will also be of benefit to those of you who are either participating as a sort of front of house speaker at the Bank of England competition or simply as a researcher. So let's get cracking on it then. First off, there are a couple of versions of the transmission mechanism, Keynesian and classical. What I'm going to be dealing with today is the Keynesian version of the transmission mechanism. I'll bring you the classical at some other point in the future. So let me just see if you can see this diagram to start with. I'll zoom in on it so we can just see what's what. So the key thing in the transmission mechanism is that we're trying to see how changes in the money market impact what we refer to as the real economy. And when we're talking about the real economy, we're talking about levels of real output, jobs, so employment, price levels, and in the case of the transmission mechanism, it's the official bank rate, so the base rate of interest, which is determining lots of other things which will then impact jobs, price levels, levels of output, etc. So the official bank rate has an impact on market rates, it has an impact on asset prices, expectations and confidence, and exchange rates. And these four things all feed into domestic demand, demand within the country, and external demand, so trade, your net exports component of AD. And that then feeds into, let me just move this around, that then feeds into the level of total demand, which feeds into the level of inflation. So that diagram in its entirety, particularly if you're a student in my class, you really need to be getting that diagram down as a starting point for the operations of the transmission mechanism. So I'm going to go through the transmission mechanism quite quickly to start with, and then come back to it and break it down a little bit further. So when you're making your notes on this and your diagrammatic analysis, you need three diagrams all adjacent to one another. So we've got one here for the money market, we've got one for the level of investment demand, and we've got one for the real economy. And you'll remember we said that the transmission mechanism tells us how changes in the money market feed into the real economy. And to reiterate, what's the real economy? It's prices, it's output, and it's jobs, levels of employment. So let's take them step by step. And as I say, I'm going to come back to these and explain how we get the diagrams and where they all come from. So the money market diagram, first of all, we've got interest rate on the y-axis, quantity of money on the x-axis, and to this I'm going to add the money supply. Note it's perfectly inelastic, and the reasons for that I shall explain later. And I'm also going to add to this a money demand curve, sloping downwards from left to right. So as the base rate, or as the interest rate falls, the quantity of money demanded rises. That yields our equilibrium position A, so we can call this RA for example. So at an interest rate of RA, we then need to consider how much investment demand that will actually bring forth. And to do that, it's quite simple. We're just going to take RA all the way across. So this is the same, so it's an equivalent point, but now we're on the investment demand curve. And again, we continue across until we touch the investment demand curve and take that down to, and we can call that IDA. So we can say that a level of interest RA, which is determined by the money market, brings forth a level of investment which is equivalent to IDA. Now, the real economy, what's the impact on the real economy there? Well, the real economy, you can see that we've drawn a Keynesian aggregate supply curve, KAS, Keynesian aggregate supply curve, and you should know all about the bottlenecks and so on in the Keynesian aggregate supply curve. This level of investment IDA, I'm going to assume brings forth a level of aggregate demand ADA. Now you'll remember that AD is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And so I'm simply assuming that this level of investment IDA is within this aggregate demand equation, and I'm saying that this is where it lies. Now you can start it off wherever you like really, it won't really make that much difference to your analysis. And so we can say that that yields a level of real output YA and a price of P. So that's our starting point. This is our starting point, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, we said at the start, I said at the start, that the transmission mechanism tells us how changes in the money market feed through to changes in the real economy. So let's implement a change in the money market. And that change is going to be an increase in the money supply. So I'm going to shift the money supply curve to the right, to MS2. Again, it's perfectly inelastic, and I'll explain why later. Now that yields a new equilibrium at point B, which gives rise to an interest rate of RB. And we simply do the same as before. So we take this across to investment demand, and we then see that the rate of interest RB yields a higher, and you would expect this, as you should know, the fall in the rate of interest yields a higher rate of investment. And bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about this type of investment here. It's not financial investment, so we're talking about investment primarily by firms on capital goods. So, I should label these up really, A and B. We have moved from there to there. Now clearly IDB is greater than IDA. And so if I were to do an AD equation again for it, C plus IDB plus G plus X minus M, well clearly because this IDB is bigger than this, then clearly ADB will be bigger than ADA. And as a consequence, I'm going to shift the AD curve to the right. ADB. YB. And this, ladies and gentlemen, has shown us the operation of the transmission mechanism, because a change in the money market has yielded a significant change in the real economy. Now what would those changes be? Well, because we've gone from YA to YB, clearly there would be more employment, potentially. We've got a higher level of Y, we've got a higher level of real output. And of course you can see here as well, price PB has risen. So we have had an increase in the price level. Now of course that is the trade-off, isn't it, ladies and gentlemen, in the Keynesian approach to this, that if you want to increase the level of real output and you're moving left to right here, well, as a consequence of that, at some point you're going to have to accept that there's a trade-off here, and you can have higher levels of real output, but the trade-off is you will have to accept that that will bring forth higher levels of price, higher price levels. But that shows us the operation of the monetary transmission mechanism. And this, ladies and gentlemen, this is how, in theory at least, but of course theory, as you'll know, economic theory has a tendency to break down all the time, and we can critique this in many ways, but in theory, when the UK government or the European Central Bank or the Federal Reserve Bank in America, when they reduce the base rate of interest, this is what they hope to achieve. They hope to achieve more employment, higher levels of real output, possibly a little bit more inflation, but they're willing to accept that because it will reflate the economy, it will expand the economy, and ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, we don't want to be in the position, for example, that Greece is in, where AD is constantly moving this way and they're headed for disaster and recession again, and a Grexit potentially. That's not a Greg Spassi, by the way. Yeah, a Grexit. But, you know, this is how it's supposed to operate, the monetary transmission mechanism. Okay, so I hope that's clear. 3 diagrams adjacent to one another, and the explanation that I've just given you. Now what I'd like to do is to run through how some of these diagrams actually come about. So I'm not going to run through this one here because you'll all be familiar with the real economy diagram. This one for investment demand, again fairly straightforward, downward sloping from left to right, falling interest rate yields higher levels of investment. Why would that be the case, ladies and gentlemen? Well, firms, especially sort of post-recession, the greatest recession and greatest global recession in post-war history, firms don't have shed loads of cash to purchase new capital equipment which could cost them tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions. And so they need to borrow the money. Well, a lower interest rate means the opportunity cost of borrowing the money is less. They're more likely, in theory, to borrow said money, and consequently the level of investment will go up. So that's fairly straightforward as well. The money market diagram is slightly more complex, and I want to have a little bit of a look at that one. So first things first. Let's get the easy parts of this out of the way first of all. The money supply, as you will know, is controlled, certainly in the case of the UK, it's controlled by the B of E, the Bank of England. And the Bank of England, whilst we used to change the money supply quite frequently, it's not so much the case anymore, but the Bank of England, because it is in control of it, it tends to keep the money supply fixed. And consequently, as you'll know, for things which, especially from your AS microeconomics, things which are fixed tend to be very inelastic in supply. And hence the reason we have the inelastic supply curves. So that's fairly straightforward. What about the money demand? Money demand, slightly more complicated, slightly more to it. So first of all, there are 3 reasons, and let me just check that you can all see this on the whiteboard. Kind of. Let me just see if I can fix this a little bit. Yeah. So there are 3 reasons why people are said to hold money. And the 3 reasons are, number 1, what's referred to as the transactions demand for money. So every day you and I, we go out, we go to school, we go to work, and we know that in the course of the day we'll have to buy newspaper, bus ticket, lunch, whatever it may be, just the normal everyday things that we buy. And so that's referred to as the transactions demand for money. Secondly, there is what's known as the precautionary demand for money. And that means that you take the essentials, the transactions demand, but you take a little bit more just in case you run into some difficulties. So for example, because I cycle into work most days, so 15, 16 miles, well, if I get a puncture, especially in the winter, I can't really be bothered standing at the side of the road to fix it. So as a precaution, I take some money with me, which means that if I really need to, I can phone a taxi, jump in the taxi, throw the bike in the taxi, and get to work. And then finally, there is something called the speculative demand for money. And this of course means that people, sometimes they'll hold money, but on other occasions they may wish to speculate and they may wish to hold things other than money. Now in most textbooks that you'll refer to, generally speaking, we would be talking there about bonds, government bonds or gilts. And you do need to know a little bit about the relationship between bond prices and interest rates for this. Let me just take you through that. It's very straightforward. So let's say that you have a bond, and I'm assuming that you know what a bond is. So a bond is government debt, and the government obviously is constantly recycling these bonds because they're constantly borrowing money for a certain period of time, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. That money is obviously maturing all the time because the bonds are issued at different time periods, and as it matures then it has to be paid off and then recycled again, and more bonds are issued. So bonds are really government debt. If the price of a bond was £100, well, the government, they don't expect you to just, or financial institutions, to give them £100 for nothing. they have to be incentivized to do that, and so they may offer them, let's say, it's known as a coupon payment. It's like an interest payment, really. So you might get £10 back on that. Now that means that your rate of interest R is obviously 10%. If, however, the demand for bonds goes up, well, if the demand for bonds, let's assume this is the bond market, demand and supply, if the demand for bonds goes up, the price goes up from P1 to P2. So the bond price might go to 200. The coupon payment, however, won't change, and that therefore means that your return on it now is, rather than being 10%, it's 5%. So there's a relationship here between the bond price and the rate of interest. As the bond price has risen from 100 to 200, the rate of interest has fallen. As the bond price falls, the rate of interest rises. So there's an inverse relationship going on there. Now, that helps us to explain why the money demand curve slopes downwards from left to right. Let me just check where we're zoomed in here again. Alright, excellent. So if I just draw the money demand curve by itself here, MD, R and quantity. So let's assume that the interest rate was up here. So we've got a high interest rate. So let's say it's 10% here. Well, if the interest rate is 10%, which is pretty high really, what would people's expectations be? People would expect that at some point in the future the interest rate is going to fall. So it may fall, as we've got here, to 5%. Well, as a consequence of that interest rate falling from 10% to 5%, that of course will push up the demand for bonds, because people would realise, well, if the interest rate falls from 10% to 5%, the bond price will rise from 100 to 200. And so at this point here, people will not be holding much sort of cash in their pocket for transactions and precautionary demand. They'll want to hold more speculative balances, i.e. they'll put a lot more money into bonds because they expect that the interest rate will fall and that will push up the price of the bond. The opposite is the case if you're at this end of the spectrum. Now, if you add together the transactions demand for money, the precautionary demand for money, and the speculative demand for money, you basically get this MD curve. It's not always drawn like that in the textbook as a straight line, but basically that's what you'll come out with. And so that's really why we end up with this money market diagram, which has the demand for money sloping downwards from left to right, and the money supply shown as a perfectly inelastic curve. I hope that's clear. It is quite a complicated thing, just the relationship between bond prices and the interest rate. Okay, now let's come back then to this diagram, the Bank of England's monetary transmission mechanism diagram, which you can find in that guidance which is sent by the Bank of England for the competition, the Bank of England competition, that is. So I want to just say a few more things about this. So we've got this official bank rate, base rate basically, set by the Bank of England. So let's just consider how it affects each of these. So the official bank rate affects market rates. By market rates we mean the rates of interest which you'll get if you go into the Halifax, Santander, your high street retail banks and building societies. Obviously, the Bank of England is known as the Bankers' Bank. It provides the liquidity into the banking system. And so, let's say for example the Halifax was short of cash, they could go to if necessary, they could go to the central bank, which is the Bank of England, and borrow some money. Well, if they have to borrow, if the Halifax has to borrow from the Bank of England at 0.5% and then lend it to you and I for a car or whatever it may be, they're not going to charge us less than 0.5% because they've already borrowed it at 0.5%. Which is why your market rates, the prices on the high street, this is one of the reasons why the market rates will be higher than the banker's bank, the official bank rate. What about asset prices? Well, we've already discussed the impact on asset prices, particularly the relationship between bond prices and the interest rate. We could also, of course, consider the relationship between the interest rate and housing prices, because as interest rates go up, probably the number of mortgage approvals would fall, and so the demand for housing would probably cool off a little bit, and so asset prices would also start to fall. You may have heard before of the economic theory, which is the wealth effect. And so people who bought a house, say mid-1980s, probably paid, I don't know, a couple of thousand for it, £2,500 maybe. Well, that same house, many years later, let's say it's probably worth £250,000, something like that. Well, the people who bought that house will obviously feel in relative terms, they feel quite wealthy. And because they feel quite wealthy, that encourages them to go out and spend in the economy. You may have heard of equity release schemes, whereby you've paid off more of your mortgage, you owe a lot of money on your mortgage, you don't owe much money on your mortgage, and so you can release equity out of the mortgage and use that to buy Porsche or fund a lavish holiday or whatever it may be. So all of those types of things are associated with the wealth effect. How does the official bank rate impact expectations and confidence? Well, there's sorry for this interruption.
Jasmine McGreevy, please come to reception. Thank you.
There's a theory which is called the rational expectations theory. And the basic premise is that it's to do with inflation primarily, but if people expect inflation to fall, they adjust their spending behaviour accordingly, and if people expect inflation to rise, they adjust their spending behaviour accordingly. Same thing goes for interest rates. If interest rates are falling, and we've had Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, issuing this forward guidance, so he's saying that in the future the interest rate is likely to be such and such. Well, forward guidance provides confidence to the markets, and people's expectations of what's going on in the markets are also given confidence and assurance as well, and as a consequence of that, they are less likely to either stop spending if the interest rate is falling, or they're less likely to not spend if they see that the interest rate is rising. And then finally, the official bank rate feeds through into the exchange rate. And the key way to remember this is, if the interest rate